post research and information there. I also have a blog, and I post some information and some exploits, walkthroughs, and things like that on my GitHub page. Oops. Sorry, I think that Zoom is taking focus and messing my, let's try this again. Okay, just a quick disclaimer. Basically everything I'm going to talk about today is done on my personal time using personal resources. It's not part of my employer, and my opinions are my own. Okay, here's the objectives for tonight. I want to share a little bit of how I got started. Working with vendors, that's a pretty big part of doing security research. Also, I want to talk about the CV process. I get a lot of questions about CV, so I wanted to cover, what CV is and the process around how to request one. I'm going to walk through a vulnerability that I found last year. I'm going to share some tips and recommendations, and then have some closing thoughts. As we go through here, if you have any pressing questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat, and Phil will let me know if there's any questions. If not, you can wait till the end, and we'll open it up. And even beyond the presentation, you can reach out to me on Twitter. All right, how I got started. So I have a couple objectives. Let's see, hopefully this is presenting correctly. All right, how I got started. I have a couple objectives here, and they are in order. So the main reason why I bug hunt in my free time is to learn and keep my skills sharp. I also have a lot of free time, so that helps too. But I really enjoy, really understanding applications and systems, and then looking for ways to, break them. I also enjoy sharing the knowledge. That's why I'm here tonight, to share some of the knowledge I have with all of you. And I also enjoy the challenge. If you're in offensive security and you finally exploit something or figure something out, it really is a great feeling. Once in a while, I get lucky and get a bounty. That's a bonus. That's certainly not my priority. If it was, I really wouldn't enjoy doing this. So the majority of my career in IT has been doing Linux and Unix administration, also some database work along the way there too. During that time, once in a while, I would discover a vulnerability and report it. It was never really my focus, but just once in a while, I would see something kind of off and do some testing and find the vulnerability. So a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to join a penetration test team at the company at the time I was working with. So right around the time that I joined that, I decided to look for some vulnerabilities in IBM DB2, which is IBM's relational database. The reason I chose DB2 was because I was familiar with it. I supported DB2 for 6 years on Linux systems and Unix systems. I had previously found vulnerabilities with DB2, and there's also many privileged binaries. So I'm going to kind of go through my first, vulnerability report as a researcher on my own. So in June of 2017, I had submitted 4 vulnerabilities to IBM's PCERT team. And at that time, they had like a web form that you would fill out. Now they're on HackerOne. So during that process, they replied back to you, and then basically I didn't hear anything for a couple months. And then in September, they released an advisory and patches for the issues that I found. So when that was publicized, my leadership shared it with the information security department as a whole. And I received a lot of positive feedback and kudos from the people I worked with. It was really an adrenaline rush. I kind of felt like a rock star. So I was hooked. So as I mentioned before, a big part of this is working with vendors. So when I first got into this, I didn't really know what to expect. I'd worked with vendors, through the company that I was working with before, but it's definitely a much different experience when you have no relationship with the company. So I worked with a variety of open source projects and big vendors, from one person companies to you know Fortune 100 type companies. And at times it can be pretty frustrating because there's no uniform way to report a vulnerability. And it's not always clear how to properly communicate vulnerability information. Some vendors and companies are better than others, and I'll get into some of those examples. So there's really a variety out there. So I think most people are familiar with HackerOne and BugCrowd bug bounty programs. There's public and private programs on there. There's other bounty programs beyond those two. Also, if you're dealing with a company that isn't on, or a program like one of those, they usually have like an email address, like security or something like that, that you can email the information to. Some use ticketing systems. I've seen a variety out there, and some have their own, custom reporting processes. There's a few times, actually a handful of times where I found a vulnerability. I want to report the vulnerability, and you go to the company or project website. There's no contact information, no vulnerability or full disclosure type procedure. So sometimes you got to get creative and try to find someone that you can contact, but it can be challenging at times. So when working with vendors, so if I'm using like BugCrowd or HackerOne, many companies have their own kind of template. So this may look a little bit different depending on what the program expects, but generally when I'm sending in a report outside of those programs, I have a template that I use. This is the loosely defined template, but I always include my contact information, usually just my name, email address, and maybe a PGP key. Once in a while, my phone number, description of the vulnerability, the environment. And by that, what I mean is, what operating system did I test the vulnerability on, the versions of the software that I tested, because that's important for them to reproduce the environment. Almost always include a CVSS score, and sometimes a CWE reference, just depends. And probably the most important thing in the vulnerability report is the impact statement. So there's a variety of people that triage reports. So the impact statement is very important so they can understand the impact. They may not understand the vulnerability itself or the technical details behind it, but they should be able to understand the impact statement so they can triage it properly. And steps to reproduce. And this is literally step by step, create this directory, create this file, run this command, install this app, things like that. And recommendations on how to fix it. Sometimes I have good ideas on how to fix it, sometimes I don't. But if I do, I'll give them some recommendations. Sometimes they ask for more details on that. Sometimes they do their own thing. But for me, I always just include recommendations if I have an idea how to do it. So I always want to communicate securely with a vendor. Oftentimes, they don't have a way to do that. If they have a mature program, usually they'll have a PGP key that you can use to encrypt a report when you email them. And some literally just don't care, and they'll take a plain text report through email. I always start with trying to communicate in a secure way, but if they let me know that they're okay with that, then I'm fine with that too. If there is a ticketing system, usually I try not to use it. Sometimes you have to create an account, which is a pain. Sometimes you can just email an address like Zendesk, will create a ticket for you. But the key here is if you do use a ticketing system to make sure that it's not going to publicly expose the information. And once in a while, a company or a project may want to use some sort of encrypted chat. So I just want to share a couple stories on my dealings with various companies. Some of these companies are big name companies, but I will protect the name. But you really run into some interesting scenarios as you go through the vulnerability reporting process. Uh, the first company here, they had a PGP key. I encrypted the report. They responded to my encrypted report in the clear, which included all the details of my original report. Definitely not what I would have expected, but things happen. Next company, same scenario. They had a PCERT, public information with their PCERT team. Use their PGP key, send them the report encrypted. So I went to do that, and their PGP key expired 2 months prior. So I had to email them to let them know that they got a new key, and then delayed the report from a couple of days. Definitely not what I would expect, but you just never know what you're going to run into. Next one, this company, they were on BugCrowd, but when you look at the programs on BugCrowd or HackerOne, usually they, depending on what size company they are, they have a limit of what types of products that they're interested in. The product was not listed on their page, so I reached out to them directly through their Twitter account. They said, go ahead and submit it on the BugCrowd system. I did that, and BugCrowd immediately closed it as not applicable. And then I let the vendor know that, and they stopped responding to me. So it can be frustrating at times, and sometimes vendors don't really appreciate your work. So some things that I've learned by working with a variety of folks triaging the report, they may not fully understand the report. So that can be frustrating for me, where I put a lot of work into something, I write it up, I send it in, and then they say, it's not an issue, or they just don't really understand the impact. So it really helps to be patient. Sometimes it takes some few emails or chats to get to a common ground. Also, the response times varies. So the fastest initial response I ever had was 3 minutes. This was something I worked on. It was a Saturday. I think I worked on this for about 9 hours. I submitted it at, I think it was like 3 or 4 in the morning. I was really excited. And before I even got to bed, they closed it as a duplicate. So it's kind of a blow right there. But that does happen. You see, similar reports on Twitter where people submit something and it's duplicate report. It's part of the game. It's not a total loss because I learned a lot through that process, but definitely frustrating at the same time. The longest initial response was 2 to 3 weeks. And the longest open report I've had over the last couple of years has 14 months. And after the 14 months, they closed it that they weren't going to fix it. So it's kind of interesting how companies handle things sometimes. Sometimes I submit a vulnerability and they tell me it's not a vulnerability. This can be frustrating for me personally because it can technically be a vulnerability, but the company or project, they don't care about it. It might be working as designed. There could be a variety of reasons, but sometimes you can do a lot of hard work and the vendor is not interested in fixing your issue at all. So that's part of it too. Overall, I have positive experiences with vendors, but sometimes it can be pretty frustrating. And just to give you a story, last year I had found a vulnerability, and it wasn't like a crazy vulnerability or anything. It was specific conditions where you could overwrite arbitrary files on a system. They did not think this was a vulnerability, so I asked them if I could publish it. Since they didn't consider it a vulnerability, the next response I got back from them, they're now considering it a vulnerability, and they ended up fixing it. So if you ever gotten that type of situation, I suggest doing the same thing because I think information is better shared. You do deal with a variety of people. Sometimes there's, some people can be jerks. So I realize that it's not myself, and I just move on and let it go because uh, it'll just eat at you, you know, if you let it get to you.
Say, Rich, we got a couple questions.
Sure.
Someone asked, do all the companies already have some type of bug bounty in place before the vulnerabilities are scanned in for testing? Would you also include public facing websites?
So it depends on what you're testing. So some companies are mature. They either are on HackerOne, BugCrowd, or some other bug bounty platform. Those are the most popular. They might run their own program, or they may not have any program. And this is one of the things that I would get to later in the talk. But um, I've had this question before. I'm using this website. I want to try to see it. I think it might be vulnerable to something. Should I try something? And if they don't have any clearly defined program, then you should not test their site. If you test their site, that could be considered, illegal, and you could be arrested and your career ruined. So it can be tempting to test, a site, but if it's not part of a program, they don't have clearly defined scope, there's absolutely no reason to test that site. There's so many companies out there that are asking you to test their sites and their software. So you got to be really careful. Even if they do have a program, you really want to understand what is in scope because that could get you in trouble.
They also had another question. How do you determine the amount of the bounty or reward?
So I don't determine that at all. That's determined by the company. So if you have like a public or a private program on HackerOne or BugCrowd, sometimes they will list out the ranges, loosely defined ranges for the severity. So like a low might be $500, a high might be, 2,000. The ranges really are all over the place. It depends on how important they think, they value that type of vulnerability. So they really set that. If you're dealing with a private company, chances are you won't know. Um, they might have a bounty program, but they may not publish what if there is a bounty involved. But you'll find out, if it qualifies for a bounty and how much. But there's really no consistency with that either. So a vulnerability that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. I have found the same vulnerability on 20 plus applications, some of which I've received a bounty, and the range I received for the same type of impact is pretty drastic. It just depends on, their program, how mature they are, and how important they are, how important they think the vulnerability research is. So it's really all over the place. Okay. So when you're working with vendors or bug bounty type programs, some may require you to sign an NDA. Some may request an embargo. Some also may require a background check. Um, in addition to that, so what I like to do is disclose my work. And probably one of the frustrating things, especially working with the different platforms, is many companies and programs, they don't allow disclosure. So if that's the case, when you know that going into it, so if you submit a vulnerability, you're in many cases not allowed to talk about what you found. But if they do allow coordinated disclosure, and what this is you basically negotiate, with the project or company and say, hey, when this is fixed, usually 90 days. There's a lot of opinions around how to disclose vulnerabilities. What I usually follow is 90 days, unless they sometimes late in the process they do some testing. There's something wrong and it's not ready to go. So for myself personally, I give vendors the benefit of the doubt and give them the time they need to patch their vulnerability. Here's just an example screenshot of a program on BugCrowd. And when you go to join the program, you see this type of notice. So if you accept this and submit a vulnerability, you're not allowed to talk about it or release details about it without, sometimes programs may allow you to do it, even if this is the case, but you would have to get it in writing. But chances are they're not going to allow it. That's why the policy is there. So one of the benefits, of doing security research is getting your name out there on websites and that type of thing. But oftentimes there's no recognition. It's just part of the game. It can be frustrating, but sometimes it's, a lot of your work goes, unnoticed. But there's also quite a few companies out there that do recognize you, and they do this various ways. Sometimes you get your name in the advisory itself. Sometimes your name gets into the release notes, or even companies with mature programs. They have like an acknowledgement page. Examples of this is like Microsoft, NVIDIA, and there's others, which is pretty cool. So working with vendors, so here's some of the things I enjoy. So I get to meet new people. Sometimes I get to work with the people that wrote the software, or I get to, work with people from different countries. It's a pretty neat experience, that they value your report, and you can work with them to, and sometimes you can actually help them with the actual technical solution too. I enjoy receiving public credit. It's always nice to, put a lot of work into a report, and then your name, gets posted online so the world can see that, you reported a vulnerability and they recognize you for it. Also receiving personal thanks. So I just wanted to share just a few examples of some different vendors I've worked with. Sometimes, they don't say much to you and just kind of like it's more of a business thing. But sometimes I do receive personalized thanks. Here's a couple examples. And that really goes a long way for me when someone takes the time to, appreciate what I did. Okay, moving on to CVEs. So you may hear people say, oh, I got a CVE, or this is my 5th CVE, or whatever. So really what that means is they found a vulnerability and there's a CVE assigned to it. You've probably seen the CVE numbers, but really what a CVE is, it's just an arbitrary number, semi-arbitrary number that tracks a vulnerability. It's managed by the MITRE Corporation. The format of the CVE has changed slightly in the last few years, but essentially it's the CVE dash the year and then some number. Anyone can request a CVE, but the key here is you need at least one public reference. If you're going to be reporting vulnerabilities, I highly recommend checking out the FAQ section because there's a lot of good information on MITRE's site. So when you go to request a CVE, there's a couple things you need to know. So I said in the last slide that anybody can request CVEs. Well, that wasn't totally true because there's some companies that or organizations that are CNA, which they essentially, assign their own CVEs. So if you send a vulnerability report to Cisco, you can't request a CV for Cisco because they will request it themselves. So just something to be aware of if you, work with big companies. The list of CNAs is not huge, but if you go out to MITRE's site, you can see the list out there. But here's just a few examples. So when you request a CVE, the process is very simple. You go to cvform.mitre.org. There's a box when you click, request a CVE. You select request a CVE. It's going to display a form, basically basic information about the vulnerability, and you submit it. And then, when you submit it, if you didn't include a public reference, so there's a couple scenarios here where let's say I submitted a vulnerability today, they patched it today or tonight, and they put a public advisory out there tomorrow, which is virtually unheard of, but it can happen. But the idea here is if there's already a public reference out there and you include it on the initial form, it will not go into reserve status and it'll be public. all the details that you see when you look up a CVE, as far as like what the application is, the version, details about what the vulnerability is, that'll all be public. In most cases, it takes time to fix the vulnerability, sometimes months or longer. So you can request the CVE at any time. So when you do that, it puts it into a reserve status. So you give it all the details except the public reference. Then it puts it into reserve status. So if you're able to Google or look up the number, this is virtually what you would see. You'd see that it's assigned or reserved, but you would see no information about what CV is. So once you get to the point where there is a disclosure, which could be a blog you write, it could be a simple text write up, it could be someone emailing like the full disclosures list. Doesn't really matter, just as long as there's a URL that you can send that's in the public domain. You go back to that same form and use the notify CV about a publication. It'll give you a form, to add the information, and it really depends on when you submit it and their workload. But usually, a couple days later, it'll be public, and eventually, when you look it up on MITRE's site, it will be taken out of reserve status, and all the details that you had submitted on the initial form will be there. So let's say a similar scenario, it's now public. The vendor, has an advisory link in there, but you wrote a blog about it or posted some information about it, and you wanted to add your link to associate it with the CVE. You go to the same form, but you just request an update to CVE, put in your new link and some information about what it is, and then same deal where it'll take a couple days or so for MITRE to approve that, and then your link will be now added to the CV. So it's worth noting that not all vulnerabilities will receive a CVE. So Phil was talking about at the beginning, especially the bug bounty programs or companies' websites. If you find a vulnerability in company.com and it's their custom application, there's not going to be a CV for that. It's generally things that will receive a CVE is software that's in the public domain. Also, sometimes companies, don't disclose their vulnerabilities, and this is kind of something like everybody knows, but I've seen it firsthand, and part of this it disturbs me. There's just an example. I submitted, I want to say it was about a dozen vulnerabilities for this software. Some of it was pretty bad, where you could potentially read, customers' information. If you were to look at their website, you would have no idea that there was a security fix at all. If you looked at the release notes, nothing is there. So I come from an admin background, and when you go to do an update, if you look at the updates and maybe it doesn't look too pressing, maybe you delay your update, but really there could be critical fixes in those updates that you'll never know because companies don't always disclose vulnerabilities in their software. As far as requesting the CV, so when I reach out to a company, if they're a CNA, I don't bother asking. But if I know they're not, I will always give them an option. If they might already have a process in place for requesting a CV, but I always offer to request it myself. Doesn't really matter to me, just as long as someone's doing it. And oftentimes the vendors are okay with you doing it. Okay, so I'm going to walk through some of the details of a vulnerability I found last year that kind of led me on probably one of the most interesting vulnerabilities that I've found. So it was probably December of 2018. Usually towards the end of the year, I have more extra time, so I kind of go on a binge and look for vulnerabilities. So at this time, I was looking at the PIA, the Private Internet Access VPN client. I found several vulnerabilities. This is one of them. If you want to check the others out, all the details are on my GitHub page. The issue with this so when you install a PIA VPN client, in the background there's a service that handles privileged operations. So when you hit connect, it's actually communicating with a backend service to do that. So when this service starts up, it looks for a configuration file. The configuration file, you can create that file and basically cause it to load a library of your choice. And it also happens to run with system authority, which is the highest authority that is on Windows. So the main tool that I use for finding these vulnerabilities is sysinternal process monitor. So if you want to do Windows type research where you're looking at files, sockets, registry, those types of things, process monitor is one of my favorite tools. There's many other tools, but if you haven't used process monitor, highly recommend checking it out. So when I use process monitor on a Windows system, one of the things I'm always interested in is files not found. I'm not sure how this is being displayed on your screen, but here's just a small snippet of the PIA service looking for a file in etc SSL, OpenSSL.cnf with name not found error. So I'm always interested in those types of files. And as I walk through this, you'll see why. So I have personally found the same type of vulnerability in over 20 applications. Here's some of the lists. Some have been fixed silently. I guarantee you that this vulnerability still exists in many applications. So if you're on a Windows systems tonight, I highly recommend you look for this vulnerability because chances are you may have something that might be vulnerable to this. So when I first started looking at this, I didn't have all the information and I was unable to exploit it. I saw that it was trying to open a file and I couldn't figure out a way to exploit it. So one of the things I do when I'm researching, I will take notes of interesting behavior and I come back to it. So every once in a while I come back. I basically tag different notes as to do. So every few months I go through that list. I may have new information, new skills, things like that that may help me exploit the vulnerabilities. This is one of those cases where a few months later I was looking for something unrelated. This came across again, so I started looking at it. So the ultimate root cause is really not related to the PIA client at all. So many apps use SSL or TLS. They're going to use the OpenSSL library. There are others, but OpenSSL for a long time has been a very popular library, so many apps still use it. So on Windows, the root drive allows unprivileged users to create folders. So if you try to create a folder like C:/foobar, it's going to allow you to do that. So when a lot of these apps like PIA, they're cross-compiled, and what that means is they're probably built on like a Unix or Linux type system. So some of these dependencies like OpenSSL, if you were to look at the OpenSSL dir path, which is a compile time directive to say, hey, this is where the OpenSSL configuration is, it will look like user local SSL, which is a Linux type path. But when that same path is sent to a function on Windows, it's translated to a Windows path. So I kind of alluded to this before. Essentially, I tried to exploit it. I was unsuccessful. A few months later, I looked at it again and I was successful. So once I have a known or a vulnerability that I proved out, I write it up, double check things, then I send it to whoever I can find to report it. In this case, it was the London Trust Media, which is the parent company of PIA. Went back and forth with them a few times. Eventually, we agreed that I was going to disclose the vulnerability on June 7th. So I was kind of burned out because I had been doing a lot of research for a few months. So I took a few months off. But then as the disclosure date got closer, I had to start working on the write-up. And one thing that I've noticed, when you're writing a blog or an exploit or whatever that's going to be seen by the world, you want to do your best to try to make it look really good. So basically I started going through that same process of just kind of replicating what I did, making sure I had screenshots, the actual commands nailed down correctly. So going through that process, I noticed other applications that had similar behavior. So the weekend prior, so originally I was going to do it on that Friday, and I realized I'm starting to find the same issue in other applications, which never crossed my mind when I first found this vulnerability because I thought it was just local to PIA. So I found it in a couple applications. I gave it the weekend. I reached out to the OpenSSL security team, but it was Sunday night, and this is the first time I would be releasing something that would be technical information on how to exploit potentially other applications. So it was really a personal struggle because I didn't know if it would be the right thing or not. But at that point, I've already had known about it for about 6 months, maybe 5 or 6 months. So I decided, let's get the information out there, and so people can see it and fix your applications. When I had reached out to the OpenSSL security team, they responded, I think it was about 2 days, and they said, working as designed, not a vulnerability. That was pretty frustrating, but they're the OpenSSL security team. I'm not going to tell them they're wrong, but basically their thought was OpenSSL distributes source code, not the binary form, so it's really up to the developers to set the path correctly. So I agreed with them and kind of forgot about it. So I continued looking for the same type of vulnerability in other applications. About a month later, I got an email from them, from the OpenSSL security team. They now considered a vulnerability. They had a CD assigned, and eventually they wrote, an advisory for that. And they fixed the default for OpenSSL there in the latest release. One thing that I found through doing this research is there's many applications that use OpenSSL that never update it. So you'll find versions of OpenSSL that are bundled with applications that could be 3 or 4 or more years old. So it's pretty rare that they update the components. So it's always nice to get system, through a vulnerability like this, but this type of vulnerability where you're really abusing, baked-in functionality, not even baked-in functionality to PIA itself, to OpenSSL. So it's normal functionality for, a library to be loaded, assuming your code that you put in that library isn't flagged. This could be used for stealthy persistence. Most endpoint solutions that are designed to protect against malicious code will not block this because it's expected behavior. You can also leverage this to install trusted certs or capture credentials. These are just a few ideas, but you get the idea. When this library is loaded, it's loaded in the background from the application. The end user or service doesn't even really know about it. It's kind of behind the scenes. And like I said before, I'm still finding this in applications. So I suggest if you're interested in Windows type research, check out my blog. I have the full walkthrough of how I found it. You can apply the same methodology to find this with other applications. And I guarantee there's someone on this call tonight that has a vulnerable application on their Windows machine. Also, the text advisory is on my GitHub page with the other vulnerabilities that I had found at that time. And I also created a tool to help find the paths, and it's called the OpenSSL dir check. Essentially what this does is it loads the library and then calls some OpenSSL APIs to get the version number and the path. You can also use strings and a couple of utilities if you wanted kind of like a raw view of that path, but this will print it out. There's also a PowerShell wrapper script to walk the entire system. If you do use this, do not run this on an untrusted system because it is loading libraries. And if you load a untrusted library, then you could be running malicious code. Okay, so I have some ideas and tips that I want to share with you. I talked about this before. Pretty much everyone knows there's bug bounty programs. HackerOne and BugCrowd are the most popular. There are others, but also the majority of work that I do is really not part of those programs. It's usually working directly with companies or projects Some of the bigger companies manage their own, like Google and Microsoft, but many small companies do too. You just have to look. Here's one Google Dork that has worked for me. You run this and you'll see that other companies that have, their own bug bounty programs, where instead of having, a program like HackerOne in the middle, you deal directly with the company, which is pretty cool. It's also worth noting for me, when I'm going to look for a vulnerability, most of the time I don't know upfront if the company has a bug bounty program or not. I really don't care because that's not my goal. If there's a bounty, great, but it's not my goal. So most of the time I have no idea if there's a bounty involved. So when you're working with these programs, most only care about specific vulnerability types. So if you're going to use HackerOne or BugCrowd, you really got to read their program page. Most of them are pretty restrictive on what they care about, and they usually list exclusions for there's like a standard list of vulnerability types that they're not interested in, and the scope can be severely limiting. It could be literally one URL, or it could be thousands of IPs. So you really want to understand before you start scanning, dynamically testing, static testing, any of that type of stuff. You want to make sure you understand the program page and the scope, because you always want to stay in scope. One of the frustrating things for me is sometimes it's not clear on the program page. I may have a question, and oftentimes there's no way to ask that question. You might be able to email support at HackerOne or BugCrowd. Sometimes the programs will have like a virtual kind of help day or chat maybe once a week or every once in a while where you can ask some questions. But generally, there's not like a quick way to ask questions, which can be frustrating when their program page isn't clear. I touched on this before, but especially if you go on BugCrowd or HackerOne, after you get some points, you start getting invites to private-only programs. Some of those programs may require an NDA or background check. Always stay in scope. Can't say that enough. If you go out of scope, bad things can happen. So always stay in scope. And sometimes the scope is not clear. Sometimes you look at their program page and they say only test these 3 sites, but then they give you like a range of IP addresses that includes a lot more things. So you have to be careful. For me, in the beginning, I started out what I was familiar with. That's what worked for me. So I started with DB2. If you're new to this, I suggest start with things you're familiar with. If you're a gamer, see if you can find a vulnerability in your game, maybe in the update process, maybe in the uninstall process, or maybe in the service that's running in the background. If you're familiar with it, you'll be more interested in it, and you already know how to use the app, so you can kind of understand how the app works. There's once in a while, there'll be disclosed reports on HackerOne. Highly suggest that you check this out because there's really good information in those reports. You can see bad reports. You can see good reports. Most of them are going to be good. You can see techniques, but probably most importantly, you can see how other people document their vulnerabilities. Sometimes, you can see their formatting. You can see screenshots, their wording and things like that. You'll see a wide range out there. So I think it's really good to, stay tuned in that and, check it on a regular basis. Also, outside of, the bug bounty type platforms, you see, every day we hear about vulnerabilities in XYZ application. Sometimes the details are pretty vague. So every once in a while, I will challenge myself and take a vague report and see if I can understand, what the vulnerability was. If they say, XYZ application under certain conditions can do this, I try to figure it out and see if I can bypass it. So that's good to do once in a while. Keeps it interesting. I know there's a lot of workflows out there, especially for like web apps, a lot of automation. For me, I don't really do automation. I have the ability to. I just don't. I like to do manual testing. I really enjoy dynamic testing. I also do static analysis too. But don't just focus on technical vulnerabilities. Uh, Probably the thing I enjoy the most using is, the functionality that's built into the application and using it against itself. So always keep that in mind. It's not just about, technical vulnerabilities. If you find a bug, submit it, even if it's not, or submit it unless it's explicitly excluded. So like said before, when you do a bug bounty program, they usually list out things they don't want to know about, like for instance, like TLS versions or weak ciphers, that type of stuff. Uh, don't bother with that stuff. Um, but if there's a vulnerability you have and it's not excluded, submit it. Sometimes you're going to disagree with the triage person. It can be frustrating. Uh, Respond in a respectful way. It can be, pretty emotional at times. You put a lot of hard work into it, and you may feel that they don't appreciate your work, and maybe they do or not. But regardless, do your best to respond in a respectful way. It will go a long way. Sometimes you need to add, additional information. So expect that. You may feel like you wrote the best report ever, but you may have missed something, or they may not fully understand your report. So, work with them to, get them the information they need. But know upfront that at times it's going to be painful and frustrating. I talked about this before, but there's really no reason, unless you want to go to jail or get in trouble, only test sites that have a program that has clearly defined guidelines. There's hundreds and hundreds of companies that are asking you to test their sites. Don't test a site that is not on those lists. Otherwise, you're just asking for problems. Twitter is really the best place out there for real-time information about various bug hunting techniques and vulnerabilities. So if you're not on Twitter, get on Twitter, start following people. Here's a link to the list that I have. It's not a complete list, but it's a list that can get you started of people that put out some good information on various types of bugs. Don't limit yourself to bug bounty programs. I think that's a good place to get started, with BugCrowd or HackerOne. There's a lot of programs there. It's not as intimidating as working directly with a company. So that's a good place to start, but, branch out from there, because there's a lot of other companies off of those platforms that will welcome you testing their applications. So take good notes. This is pretty crucial. So use what works for you. For me, I generally use Evernote. And the main reason I've used Evernote is because it's cross-platform. I used it during my OSCP, so I'm familiar with it. It's not the greatest at everything, but it works for me. I also, create text files. Doesn't really matter. Just use whatever works for you, but take good notes. So as I am looking for vulnerabilities, I often find other interesting, unrelated things. I take notes of that and try not to go down that rabbit hole. Sometimes it's hard because I don't know how many times I've found a vulnerability because I was looking for a different vulnerability. It happens all the time. It's pretty cool. But if you don't take the notes, you might miss out on opportunities. So what I've learned over the last couple of years is, as I go through the process, I learn new techniques, new things, kind of look interesting to me that didn't look interesting to me a year ago. So I make note of that and I come back to it and then, investigate it. It may be nothing, but it's still worth doing it. Back up your notes. If you lose your notes, it's going to be a sad day. Document your failures. So I was just talking about this. When I first looked at that PA vulnerability, I failed. I couldn't get it to do what I wanted it to do or what I thought I could do with it. A few months later, I was able to. So if I didn't document that, I would have had a harder time. I would have to redo things. I'd probably miss out on things. So document your failures. Document the steps you tried. Whatever tools you did, inputs, outputs, that type of stuff. And you might have enough information at a later time to exploit it. So what I've learned is failing is a good thing. Failing is can be frustrating, especially when you work hours and hours on something only to realize that you failed. You weren't able to accomplish your goal of what you originally thought. But what I've learned is when I fail, I really push myself to to learn new things and try different techniques. If I take an application and I find a vulnerability in 30 seconds, that's great. But chances are I might not push myself as hard because I found something so early. I may not even try to do anything else at that time. If I don't find anything, I'm going to, you know, do things that I normally wouldn't do, and it really builds on your techniques and knowledge. And full disclosure, I fail more often than I succeed. That's just the reality of it. If I post something, it may look good. I found this vulnerability, but you know what? I failed 20 times prior to that doing other things. But remember, failing is a good thing. So we have a huge community, in this local area, in the Dallas area, but really the entire world. There's so many people that are willing to help. Ask your friends, ask people online. There's always people willing to help you. When you do ask for help, do your homework. People don't like just giving you the answer. They want to know that you are serious about, doing the work. Um, so keep that in mind. Um, don't disclose a vulnerability until a patch is available. That's my general process. There's some exceptions to that, but generally, I will give the company or project the benefit of the doubt to give them an opportunity to fix whatever the vulnerability is. If you do find a vulnerability, search the same application for similar vulnerabilities. Chances are that code is either called by different areas of the application or copied to other areas of the application. Um, if I had done that with the PIA, I would have found this same type of vulnerability with other applications. So um, it's using the OpenSSL framework. I should have at the time like, oh, everything uses OpenSSL, and look beyond that application. So, take that same process, think of other applications that may be using that same framework, libraries, dependencies, techniques, or whatever. You may be able to find other apps with the same issues. Take breaks. I have a hard time with balance, so I usually go full throttle or nothing at all. So sometimes I will spend outside of my normal day job 30 to 40 hours a week doing bug hunting type stuff. After a while, that gets to be a little much, so I usually take a break. So do what works for you, but you do need to take breaks once in a while. So overall, the vulnerability reports that I have sent, I've always received good feedback. So here's some of the tips to help you create a report, whether it's on a bug bounty program or not. Create a template. That way you have something to work off of. You may have to tweak it depending on the program. Also keep in mind that the report that you're writing may become public, especially if you're on HackerOne or BugCrowd. You may make the report public or someone might publicize it. So keep that in mind when you're writing it. Be professional, try to stick to the facts, keep emotion out of the reports, and always spell check. There's times I've submitted reports and I go back to look at it and I'm like, what was I thinking? Like simple spelling errors or grammar type errors. Sometimes when you find a vulnerability, you get really excited, you're trying to write it up quickly and the quality of your report suffers as a result. So always, take a step back, spell check, look for grammar. If someone is helping you with it, or your wife or spouse or whoever, you may want to have them take a look. Even if they don't understand the technical material, they could point out like the simple grammar formatting type errors. Document an impact statement. So I believe this is really the most important thing on a vulnerability report. Because whoever's triaging the report may not understand the report itself, but they should be able to install or should be able to understand the impact, so they can triage it successfully. If you know how to fix it or have an idea how to fix it, give them that information. Sometimes the developers they're not thinking from a security mindset, so you may know how to properly fix something. So give them the technical solution or idea of what you think. Offer to retest. I always offer to retest, and most companies, projects do not ever take me up on that. I don't understand why. Once in a while they do, but sometimes this could be a bad thing for them. The most recent example is VMware. So there's the vulnerability, privilege escalation vulnerability in VMware Fusion. It took them roughly 4 months to fix it. They released it. Information was public. If you took my test case that I sent them 4 months prior, it worked without modification at all. So I don't know what happened on their side, but they totally missed the ball on that. They never asked me to retest. They put out a temporary fix, which contained a different vulnerability that another researcher had found. They put out another fix and still is vulnerable. So I always offer to retest. Regardless if they take me up on that offer, I will always retest myself when the new application or update is available. So here's a couple resources to get started in bug hunting. A lot of these are going to be web focused, but they're really great resources. So the Port Circuit Web Academy is just awesome. It covers, has challenges for all the different vulnerability classes. HackerOne and BugCrowd, they have videos on all kinds of things. You can literally spend days and days watching these videos and trying the different challenges. So I highly recommend checking those out. So I got asked this question before, so I'm just going to share some of the tools that I used often. This is not a complete list, but here's some of the tools. So like on Windows, Process Explorer, Process Monitor, IO Ninja, really the whole sysinternal suite, but the Process Monitor is really one of my favorite utilities. If you want to do some disassembly or decompiling, you can use Ghidra, Binary Ninja, or IDA. For Mac, I use Hopper. And the cool thing about this is, so I know enough, to get by. I am not, I can't write assembly by hand. By far, is that my strongest language or anything like that? But even just having a general understanding of the program flow can help you potentially understand the application and find a vulnerability. On Linux, strace is probably my favorite utility, and it allows you to trace system calls. You can use ltrace, GDB, strings, and grep. Sometimes the simple utilities really get you a long way. On Mac OS, dtrust and monitor are probably the main ones I use to kind of get insight into an application. For web, I use Burp Suite. I mean, everybody does. There's other web utilities too, but that's really the main thing I use. And in Burp Suite, since I do manual testing, I really use the basic features of Burp Suite. I usually don't do anything fancy with that. Always using Bash. SoCat is really awesome utility. Curl, Git. I like to version my code. So I suggest if you're going to write code, definitely use Git. For virtualization, mainly I use VMware Workstation now. I also use VirtualBox, and I have an ESXi server as well, but primarily I use these two. I mentioned this before, always retest your vulnerabilities. There's many times where vendor has released a fix and they either didn't fix it at all or they didn't fix it properly and you're able to bypass their fix. So when it becomes available, when you have time, retest your whatever the application is. So I believe knowledge is better shared. So consider writing a blog. And when you write a blog, for me, I write a blog for myself. So I reference my blog all the time for examples of stuff I've did. Other people can benefit from it too, but it's really good. You may think that what you have, maybe, no one's going to care about it, whatever. It doesn't matter. If you keep in mind that you're writing it for yourself, that's all that matters. But I can guarantee you that someone will benefit from the information you write. The techniques you used is really the most important part. Anybody can find a vulnerability. The vulnerability might be cool, but the process to find the vulnerability, I believe, is the most important part. So sharing your methodology, techniques, those types of things are really important. Post your code, advisories, whatever you want to GitHub or whatever site makes sense for you. That way, other people can use them, as a template or learning. Teach and mentor someone. So this is something I really enjoy. People have reached out to me and I've helped them with vulnerabilities, or I've taught them some of the things I know, and then they find a vulnerability based on the information that I help teach them. It's the greatest feeling in the world. So share the knowledge, and help other people. Share it on social media. This can help people, but it also can help build your brand. And lastly, just have fun. That's what it's about. Hunting for vulnerabilities for me it's what I enjoy to do. That's why I spend hours and hours pretty much every day doing it, because I really enjoy it. So that was the conclusion of my talk. I really appreciate you spending your night with me. Here's some of the links I had on the original slide. If you didn't get that before, I'd like to open up for any questions. And if you don't, ask a question now or you can't, reach out to me on Twitter. I'll answer any questions you have. Or if you ever have ideas or about a technique, or you're stuck on something, let me know. I really enjoy, partnering with other researchers.
Well, thanks, Rich. We've got some questions here. Someone asked, what's your favorite type of bug to start with or go after?
So for me, local privilege escalation, or privilege escalation in general, I just love escalating my privileges. Originally, it was all about getting root or system, but more recently, I've looked at horizontal type privilege escalation vulnerabilities, where you do something and it will cause a lower privilege user to gain access to their account or execute code as them. So yeah, I love privilege escalation.
And we have someone else that asks, is there a disadvantage to getting your name out there?
I don't know of any disadvantages. For me, it's really been a positive experience. I think it's how you present the information. If you drop 0 days and do things from a malicious perspective, people are not going to respect you. But if you do it, in a responsible way, then, I've received really good feedback. I've received good feedback from companies. Like last year, I didn't get a chance to go to like DEF CON or Black Hat, but a couple of companies I had worked with through the year asked me if I was going. They wanted to meet up with me. So for me, it's been really positive and really expanded my network of friends and other people that I can reach out to when I have, when I hit walls and things like that.
And we have another question. What skills besides web development are needed for bug bounty?
So for me, and this is kind of offensive security in general, it's not so much about what you know, it's about what you can learn. So offensive security for myself is, you're always hitting things you don't know. You can leverage your experiences and your knowledge, but you're always learning new things. That's really what it's all about. So I have a sysadmin background, primarily on Linux and Unix systems, and that has helped me greatly in finding bugs. Because if you can understand how the underlying system works and how applications work, then when you go up to a higher level at the application or even web application level, you have a pretty good solid base of where to start. So, knowledge about the systems themselves, and, if it's a web app, if it's PHP, if you've never written PHP before, or if it's a Java app and you've never written Java, you'll have a harder time. But if you've been a Java programmer for the last 15 years, you're going to have a better understanding. So the more you can understand about the actual infrastructure underneath and, languages, that will really help. But the best thing to do is just get started. Start with what you know, what you like to do, and branch out from there.
And we have someone on the chat that I'm sure there's more than just one, but we have an aspiring red teamer.
Okay.
Wants to get into it fairly quickly. And they said, what's a good way to get into sysadmin?
So the way I got started a while back was, so I've always ran my own servers. So I've been running my own physical server for quite a long time. So, and this isn't just for sysadmin. This goes really for any type of job in offensive security. Doing things on your own. So if you want to be a sysadmin, probably the biggest thing right now from an admin perspective is like cloud. So learning probably AWS primarily, the other environments too, but learning more about that, running your own servers, going through the whole process, of administering, set up your own website, you know, use Apache, use Nginx, get experience with different technologies, and just be tinkering all the time.
And we have another question. How do you just go on a CVE search?
So there, you can Google it. You can check out. There's different. You'll see stuff come across Twitter all the time. There's also full disclosure lists, which I highly recommend you joining. It's the one in Open Wall. So most mornings I will see if anybody posted any information to that. Also, checking Twitter, um, things in the news. Or you can just search. You could do a CB search on miter.org. So if you're interested in a specific product, you can do a search by product name, that type of stuff. So um, there's really a variety of places you can find information. The ultimate source is going to be MITRE, but there's a lot of stuff in the news, full disclosure lists, uh, write-ups, that people write up for vulnerabilities. It could be GitHub, people's blogs. It's really all over the place. So I say search for, so let's say you use Notepad++. Search for Notepad++ vulnerabilities. There might be existing write-ups or existing CVEs with minimal information. So there's really a lot of information out there. If there's not a write-up, there might be minimal information in the CVE. So it might be pretty generic where, a user could take over the system, if they ran this app. Not very helpful. But sometimes some of the CVEs, even though they're vague, they may provide enough information to get you started in the right place.
Okay, someone else asks, what do you use as a test lab environment? Virtual machines or dedicated machines?
So I have dedicated machines, but I use virtual machines within those machines. So I use on Mac, I'll use VirtualBox, or no, sorry, not VirtualBox. I was using VirtualBox on a Mac, but had a lot of issues with it. So I use VMware Fusion. On my Windows laptops, I use VMware Workstation, and I use VMs. And I try to use, snapshots, or I just, usually if I don't have like a base image handy, I'll just go to Microsoft. They provide images that are good for 90 days. Sometimes you can extend it or just re-download it. So yeah, virtual is definitely a way to go. That way you can easily revert back or have, an environment where you start with. So recently I started building like a base image with a lot of the tools that I use just to have them so I don't have to spend time installing the same type of software every time. So I definitely highly recommend, using some type of virtualized system. VMware works for me. VirtualBox, works too, but for me on the Mac, it has caused problems in the past. So highly recommend that.
And we have another question. I think you answered this earlier, but the person had to step away. They were asking about AI using automation for bug hunting. What do you think
Uh,
about that?
so I think if it's great if that's what you want to do, if your goal is to find as many bugs, that's probably the way to go. My goal is not to automate. I do automate some tasks, but I don't automate really looking for bugs because what I really enjoy the most about bug hunting is manual testing, especially dynamic testing, and trying, using the application and trying to understand how it works, especially when I don't have access to any of the source code. It's pretty gratifying. If I just ran it through you know, some automation and it spits out a report, for me, that's not enjoyable. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use automation, but for me personally, that's not my main focus.
That was good information to share, but I got their question wrong. Actually, they're talking about testing AI with bug hunting. So I got it backwards.
Um, I don't really know anything about AI. For me, when I hear AI and blockchain and that type of stuff, I laugh usually. So unfortunately, I really don't know about that stuff.
You know, when you really think about that, it's an application, so I don't see that it would be tons different because you know AI applications running on a computer. So I guess if that would answer their question, then you would use a lot of techniques you'd use for other binary based
Yeah.
code.
Yep. Yeah. And if I'm doing automation, it might be like a quick script, because of what I'm doing, is a little painful. But as far as looking for the vulnerabilities themselves, for me, it's a manual process.
So we got one last question here from Quentin. He said, "Will you let him pet all your cats?"
We'll have to see.
Well, I appreciate you giving us a talk. Someone just asked, said, "How much, as far as tools you use, are free versus paid?"
I would say majority are free. Um, the tools that I've paid for is Burp Suite. Let's see, Burp Suite, IO Ninja, Binary Ninja, Hopper, and I'm not sure what else, but that's the main ones I can think of. But most of the tools I use are free or open source.
Okay. Someone asked, "What's the best virtualization software for Mac?"
VMware Fusion, hands down.
Yeah, actually, was using VirtualBox myself, and and VMware Fusion. It works a lot better if you're using any kind of USB devices to plug in. I went through the SANS ICS course recently, and it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing how easier it is to connect to USB devices within Fusion compared to
Yeah, I mean,
VirtualBox.
for me, I've definitely had issues with VirtualBox. I still use it because I have VMs that I haven't migrated over, but for me, VMware Fusion really, it's pretty smooth. So highly recommend using that.
And someone said, we publish a vuln if the company doesn't respond to your reports?"
I have been in this situation before, um, and so far I haven't not done that. I may do it at some point. Um, Probably depends on what the vulnerability is. Um, so it depends.
Okay, someone asked, "What's the best way to overcome rabbit holes?"
Um, Rabbit holes, I think, are good. I think that's where I learn the most. Um, so since I'm spending my own free time on this, going down rabbit holes isn't a big deal. Rabbit holes are more important when it's your day job. So you really, got to know when you've spent enough time on something. And I've mentioned this before. You may not have all the information or enough time or resources to fully exploit what you're trying to exploit. You may know it's exploitable based on the behavior you've seen. You just don't have the right information at that time. So I put it, gather the information and come back to it later. But it's not easy.
No, that's all the questions we had. Thanks for the presentation.
You're welcome.
It
I
was awesome.
appreciate everybody attending tonight. If you have questions or just want to chat, have ideas or whatever, reach out to me. I always like talking to other people in this field.
Great. We'll have this recorded and posted up on the YouTube page, and I will send that to you.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for joining. Next Monday, we've got a talk from Tim Leonard from the Deep East Texas Security Group. He'll be doing a talk next Monday. So same time, go out to meetup. It'll be the same link as we used tonight. We did start adding passwords to our Zoom meetings, but that's about all that's changed as far as that goes. So hope to see you then. Thanks everyone for joining.